Today I'm going to be speaking about teacher feedback on ESL student writing for either creative writing or creative nonfiction pieces like the personal narrative in Composition 1. This video is rooted in process pedagogy. I'm going to be teaching instructors to give effective feedback on writing in both written and oral forms, as though it is still a draft, not necessarily a final product. The main aim of this video is to restore agency to ESL students through teacher feedback. Education should be seen as their journey. As teachers, we are just participants or guides to this journey. There are a few pedagogical theories that this lesson is based around. The main pedagogical theory is established in Joy Reid's work responding to ESL students' texts, The Myths of Appropriation. She argues in this text that instructors must see intervention, or feedback, in the wider context of discourse communities, by responding to students' own purposes and goals, and by negotiating text meaning through questioning, conferences, and written comments. To encourage deep revision, teacher feedback should not be focused on traditional sentence-level correction, which has been found to contribute only minimally, if at all, to meaningful revision by L2 writers, as indicated by Anson, Flower, and Hayes, but instead should focus on student power and education and the practical strategies which promote student-based learning and revision. The following two methodologies should be combined to produce effective written and oral feedback, which encourages ESL student empowerment. One should be an author's note, and two should be student conferences. To begin with author's notes, this note must represent a thoughtful reflection on student writing, concerning what is needed next rather than ultimately, and asks for help from workshop members or teachers. The author's note must contain 3 parts, in no particular order. First part will be identifying the strengths and weaknesses of the work, as appropriate for the stage. Stages will be discussed in more detail shortly. The second part is the type of feedback needed to improve the student writing, as identified by the student. For example, students can ask for praise and support, which is self-explanatory, say back, in which feedback is focused solely on the student's questions, or even my house, which asks the workshop members or teachers to put themselves in the shoes of the writer and makes comments about how they would change it if they were in their own piece. The third part, then, is a discussion of the writing process thus far. This includes the number of drafts, the number of hours, and even identifies the stage of the piece. It can include feelings, such as being excited or frustrated, and an explanation why. It should be noted that students should never apologize for their work. The draft isn't bad, it just isn't done. Borrowing from Elbow, ESL students can use bones, muscles, or even the skin stage to identify where they are in the process. The bone stage is the first phase in writing. This is common in beginning drafts. Feedback should be focused on the content and ideas, as the student is still developing and discovering what they want to say. Next, then, is figuring out how they're going to say it, which comes in with the muscle stage. This stage focuses on organization and format. Then ultimately, the third stage is the skin stage. This phase builds on the other two, narrowing the focus to sentence-level corrections, such as word choice or even voice. To implement author's notes into your curriculum, ESL students will need to be taught the expectations of process pedagogy, such as the goals and procedures to multi-draft assignments, prior to providing feedback. From there, then, we can discuss how to give effective written feedback. Scholarship on ESL feedback has been split, with most researchers ultimately arguing that more direct feedback is necessary in the classroom setting, especially with oral commands and comments. The differences between direct and indirect feedback are as follows. Direct feedback identifies the error and corrects it for the students. It may sometimes provide an example of the proper form, whereas indirect feedback identifies the error but does not self-correct. Instead, students must correct it. Indirect feedback is found to encourage deeper revision and learning retention. It cuts down on the frequency of mistakes in drafting. There are 4 different types of indirect feedback. The first is marking the number of errors in the margin on each line. The second would be underlining, circling, or highlighting. The third is marking the type of errors in the margin. And then the fourth is a combination of underlining, circling, or highlighting, and marking the type of errors. Written feedback can also take multiple forms, either as in-margin comments or endnotes, or even a combination of the two. For the purposes of personal narratives from ESL students, they may benefit most from margin comments as outlined above, depending on the area of focus and the revision stage. However, the main concern with teacher feedback for ESL students is that the comments will not be understood. Ferris reported that 50% of students surveyed answered that they had problems understanding written teacher feedback, and that half of them did not go into the teacher to have it explained. Therefore, a supplementary method must be included into the curriculum. As I'll argue, this supplementary method should be student conferencing. In addition to author's notes, the second methodology which will produce effective written and oral feedback to encourage ESL student empowerment is student conferencing. There are several benefits to student conferences. If used as a supplement or a step after receiving written feedback, students are given the opportunity to not only control their interaction, to actively participate, but also to clarify their teacher's feedback. This also benefits the teachers. We're able to interact dynamically with our students, which helps us understand our students' initial intent of drafts and to build an individual rapport with them, which will ultimately make them feel more comfortable to ask for additional help or seek further feedback. Lastly, it saves us teachers time in having to longhand written comments. According to the article, Student Input and Negotiation of Meaning in ESL Writing Conferences by Lynn Goldstein and Susan Conrad, little research has been done on ESL student conferences. Much of the past research focused on native speaker conferencing. In these studies, these conferences had predictable parts: openings, student-initiated comments and questions, teacher-initiated comments and questions, the reading of a paper, and then final closings. Much of the literature suggests that the very act of conferencing leads students to contribute input by setting an agenda, making their needs known, expressing their ideas and opinions, and even asking questions or clarifying meaning. However, this has not been found to be the case for many ESL students. Instead, there's a high variability in the interaction with the teacher-student dynamic. Teachers must be cognizant of the following: allow students to nominate the topics, balance speaking time, and elicit responses and participation. Within the same article, which focused on native speakers, native students who engaged in exploratory talk and who initiated more discussion in the conference made revisions that contained deeper analysis of the subject. While the same was not entirely found true by ESL students, the same could be applied when applying negotiation to conferencing. When they applied their negotiation techniques discussed in conferencing to revision, all of these were successful revisions. I have a few recommendations on eliciting responses for ESL students. There are different types of corrective feedback that can be given orally. There are corrective feedbacks that are provided. There are 3 of those. And there is effective feedback that can be elicited. There are 5 of those. To talk about correct forms that can be provided, we can start first with recasts. An example of a recast is if a student were to say, "I have 20 years old." The teacher would simply correct and say, "I am." This is considered a partial didactic recast. Another example of a recast is if a student asked, "I can lend your pen." They may additionally try again with, "Can I lend your pen?" The teacher would respond with, "You mean, can I borrow your pen?" The second type of provided feedback is explicit correction. If a student were to say, "She go to school every day," and the teacher were to respond, "It's not she go, but she goes." Then the third type is linguistic explanation. If a student were to say, "Yesterday rained," and the teacher corrected with, "Yesterday it rained," you need to include the pronoun it before the verb. In English, we need it before this type of verb related to weather. Then there are types of elicited responses. To correct forms of elicited responses, there are 5 of them that I'm going to be speaking about today. The first is repetition. If a student were to say, "I eated a sandwich," and the teacher would question it by saying, "I eated a sandwich?" The second is elicitation. If the student were to say, "When did you went to the market?" and the teacher were to respond, "When did you?" The third type is metalinguistic cues. A student may say something like, "There were many women in the meeting," and the teacher would have to respond with, "You need plural." The fourth type is a clarification request, with something as simple as "sorry," or "pardon me," or "I don't understand what you just said." And the fifth type, which won't be discussed in further detail, is body language. With student conferencing, a common question is, how often should you have student conferences? The short answer to this question is, it all depends. Not only on the length of the course, or the types of writing assignments and the rigor of the classroom, but also the other types of feedback which may be given, like peer workshops. The long answer to this is that students, as Elbow suggests, should not receive teacher feedback on every single one of their work. Instead, you should allow low-stakes writing, which will not be conferenced, but all major assignments should have the opportunity for at least 2 fresh eye opportunities, though maybe this is not always teacher feedback. In a personal narrative setting, I recommend that at least 2 conferences be done, once during earlier stages, such as in the bones or muscles stage, and an introductory conference to set the rules and to familiarize yourself with your student, as Tobin discusses. The main concern with student conferences among native speakers and ESL students is that the interaction between the teacher and student in an institutional setting is one with unequal status. The teacher in an institutional setting is a representative who claims the authority and power. This unequal relationship between teacher and student may influence the way that students talk. Students tend to minimize their speech acts, such as making suggestions, correcting advisors, or offering evaluations and compliments, and even sometimes rejecting advice. Now, this is why we must argue that student conferences can't stand alone. They should be used in conjunction with authors' notes. Written comments offer silence and space from the teacher that allow the students to make their own choices in revision. Therefore, with these 2 strategies, we may start to restore agency to ESL students and inspire deep revision driven by student self-interest through teacher feedback.